This is a painting I did starting with acrylics and finishing with oils. The first tower block in acrylics is shown here, and basically what I did use heavy body golden acrylics and a flat 6 brush. I did not use any other brushes. For the oil rendering, it took me about an hour and a half, and I used the ARTISAN Winsor Newton water mixable oils and several different brushes, although the majority is done with a flat 6. So this is the area in Boston. You have the Boston Commons, and the Prudential Tower has a very characteristic, recognizable skyline, especially when looked from the Longfellow Bridge, which joins the Cambridge area of Kendall Square, especially, to the area in Boston near the Boston Commons. So walking in Cambridge in the Harbor Walk, positioning yourself where I was actually looking at the Longfellow Bridge, you can see the Prudential Tower, and it's a very nice view. I will explain this, and I will tell you what was exactly the view. So again, from that perspective, this was a summer early evening, and as you can see, there were several elements that I liked about this composition. First, I really love dapple light. I really exaggerate them in my paintings because I think it gives the eye an element of curiosity and also helps with defining shapes. The other thing is that this particular view has very strong contrast, tonal contrast, very darks against very lights. So the lightest light is actually right up against the darkest dark. And that's also something that normally pleases the human eye. Same thing, the composition has those darks and lights, not just in one area of the composition, but in several areas. Another thing I like is having the tree or an element that's close to me. In my view, having the trees both in the left and in the top right help in the composition with framing the final focal point in the middle of the painting, which again has a strong tonal value contrast difference with darks and lights on this now not used pier. This is closed up, but you can actually see very nice reflections. And I thought this was a very interesting element that actually ends up bringing the eye to what I believe would be the focal point, which is the Prudential building. So compositionally, I really liked what I was seeing from this area in Cambridge. The first step in the composition when painting this particular image, I located the vertical and the horizontal middle points. It was much easier for me to locate the 4 quadrants and try to look at them as individual paintings so that the placement of the shapes were in the right place. So next up was drawing the perspective lines. And for instance, for the railing on the right bottom quadrant, it is easier to see how it almost divides that quadrant in half into trapezoids. So it wasn't really that difficult to draw these lines on the white canvas and start guiding where I was going to put the shapes. After these, put the vertical elements and block in the buildings. So I did put where the buildings are. I put sort of shapes for these buildings, and then start blocking not only the darks, but I wanted to bring also some of the colors on the top right with the light orangey color block in where that particular tree was going to have some highlights, and make sure that the darkest darks are refined. So I did all of these on the canvas guided by this computer work that I had done before in preparation to the painting. And the darkest darks are done with a combination of the green, the blue, and the red in different proportions. So at this point, this is the way that the canvas was looking like. I had marked the 4 quadrants and I placed the perspective. I also had painted with a combination of a light purplish color the buildings in the back. And basically, I did very dark areas. It wasn't really purple. I will explain to you using the colors that I had at hand. This was much darker, but it was a light wash, transparent wash, and it used phthalo green, blue, and red, magenta. So basically, all of the darks were noted, and in the blocked in, I also emphasized or other areas of the dark. So this was the idea I had, and this is what I did during the first hour using acrylics, following this particular sort of schematic that I had used using the computer. So basically, this is how it would overlay what I had decided to do on the photo. And this is how it actually overlays on the acrylic painting. So I did make a mistake that I did not notice when I was putting the darks. I placed the left bushes very vertical. So they basically are covering the building in the back. And I could have fixed it, but I did not. So the final painting has that particular area is a little bit complicated to resolve. Maybe I should have moved it the way it was so I could paint the building the way that I was seeing it, but I didn't. So I left it this way. I started the painting using a cotton canvas that was pre-toned with golden acrylic, Indian yellow. On the top left, you can still see through the color that the whole canvas was painted on. I used the golden Modern Colors Theory acrylic kit. And from that kit, I used the anthraquinone blue, I used the phthalo green, the quinacridone magenta, the Hansa yellow medium, and titanium white. And for the whole painting, I used a flat 6 brush. I started carving the leaves from the trees using the sky color, which was basically a mixture of the blue, very little green, and a lot of white. This can be seen in several areas where I was carving out the leaves because the rest of it was basically the dark colors that I had applied before as just large shapes. I added the clouds using a flat brush and more white, not completely mixed with the rest of the paint colors for the sky. And it was just basically strokes that were either horizontal or some of them vertical, but I just wanted to make sure that the lighter area of the sky was marked with these beautiful clouds that are actually making the shape of the buildings more interesting. For the water, I also carved the reflections. So what you see on the dark is basically the wash of the mixture with the quinacridone magenta and the phthalo green very lightly applied. And with the water, I started carving out some of these reflections. I used the same flat brush, but on the side to give the impression of movement in the water. The highlights to shape some of the bridge in the back, I painted a little bit of the quinacridone magenta on top of the darker violet that I had applied before on top of the bridge. And I did the same in several of the structural areas to make them recede a bit on the back. And I like putting the highlights on the dark, more greenish area that I had painted on the bottom right. And just painting the highlights gives the impression of the railing, of the curved railing and the wall, which is really basically a very flat, dark area in there. And I finally used also the green, the yellow, and the white for the very bright patch in the back, which is very interesting in the photo, and it just provides a contrast. Also added the dapple lights a little bit on the path. And again, this dark area was not really worked much more than the very light wash at the beginning that I used. I also used a little bit of the highlights for the bushes on the left, but basically this is the 1 hour work in the acrylic paints to give the idea of how the painting would go. To create the painting in oils, I used the Artisan water mixable oils by Winsor Newton. They have ultramarine blue, phthalo green, alizarin crimson permanent, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow medium, and titanium white. Again, the carving of the trees and the leaves was done in a very similar way than with the block in by using the sky color. And it's very notable in all of these two areas. I highlighted the clouds, putting a lot more white and contrast with the light because I wanted to really bring the eye to that patch of light in the early evening when the sun's hitting the Prudential building from the right-hand side, which would be the west. And I also did some of the highlights on the tree on the back, on the top right. And on the left, I left very dark areas on the tree and just adding a little bit of the light on top. For the water, I carved the reflections and from the trees and from the buildings because I wanted to use the same idea, but I wanted to make sure that the tonal value was correct. Lighter in the back with less wavy motion because it's farther from us. This is the Charles River. And darker to us and more waves and thicker waves as I come near the front or the bottom of the panel. Then the highlights to the railing were done very roughly, but using basically the same idea as I had from the original block-in. It was extremely useful to have the block-in to be able to do the final painting in oils because I basically just used what I had before to add these dapple lights, the lights and the darks, the tonal values, and make sure that I then used better tonal shapes with different colors, especially on the building in the back. I mentioned before that I positioned this tree in the wrong place. It, in the reality, in the photo, was really leaning to the right, so we could see the building in the back. And also a little bit of the structure of the Longfellow Bridge, which has the pylon in there. So I tried to carve it without attracting too much of the attention of the eye to that back building or the Longfellow Bridge, but with sufficient brush strokes that it actually creates a narrative that makes sense. And I brought that all the way to the rest of the Longfellow Bridge and in general all the buildings in the back. Without really clear definition, I wanted to make sure that I could distinguish the buildings in the back, a little bit of the greenery in the back, the river, and the Longfellow Bridge without paying attention to detail. I did the same with some of the highlights on the right, which is where the contrast, the tonal contrast was most notable. And I wanted to make sure that without painting the trees in detail or the wall, I didn't paint any cars, by the way, but I just wanted to do literally just brush strokes with tones and colors to create the impression of a structure that we can see behind the trees. And finally, for the water, I worked a lot on the values, tones, and colors so that it would actually be a little bit darker in the bottom rather than the middle of the panel, so that we could create some perspective, atmospheric perspective. This is how the photo side by side with the acrylic block in looks like. So I did exaggerate a little bit the perspective of the railing. I didn't realize that until I put them side by side. And this is how the two paintings look together. And this is how the final painting looks with a photo. I hope that you enjoyed it. And tune in my YouTube channel and subscribe if you like it. Thank you.